Hello, amigos. So this week I learned about React.Memo, which is not this, but it's this. Uh, Memoization is a technique in functional programming. It's an outcome of functional programming. The idea being simple that if a function is pure, then same input always gives you same output. So before we see how we can implement this in React and why and how it adds to the performance, let's try to understand the mathematical foundation of it so that it's clear when we start implementing it in React. Let's take an example of a multiplication. Let's say we have been asked to multiply 37 by 13. Uh, I'm not a very good mathematician, so I would simply draw the table. I would multiply 37 by 3. So 111 multiplied by 37, yada, 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 and 481 is the answer, right? So I did this whole process and I got to the number 481. Fair enough. So let's say 10 minutes down the line, you again ask me, hey, what is 37 by 13? Now, this time I don't really have to multiply because I remember it, right? I know if my one number is 37, other is 13, the answer is 481 without going through all this function, the drawing the whole table of multiplication. And that's pretty much an example of React Memo. The idea is pretty simple. If we have a function which takes n number of arguments and returns me an output, as long as there is no side effect, so that means it's not updating some database, randomly generating some magic, or doing some stuff, the output would always be exactly the same. Same input, same output, always the time. And this is pretty good for React because what it can do in multiple renders is to say, hey, in the previous cycle, I had passed on these props to this component. Have the props change in my new rendering cycle? If no, then I don't even call that function. I don't even call the component anymore to figure out what the output should be. I know the output. I will just reuse what I had previously. So what happens, imagine a scenario where we have a big tree of components. We have a parent component, child 1, child 2, child 3, child 4. If something is happening on the parent which actually doesn't bother child 2, why should child 2 be recalculated? That's the whole idea behind React.Memo. The second is the use memo function. It's also pretty much similar in its outlook. So it does some calculation. It has some input parameters. As long as parameters stay the same, we don't need to run the function. Remember, I'm saying we don't have to execute the function again. So we save the performance time in that front. So let's see an example of it. First, we see without React demo, and then see how we can improve it with the use case of React demo. And lastly, we will also tackle the important question of why not just wrap our complete React application with React.Memo. So stay tuned. So we have a simple Amazon, sort of an Amazon page where an user can browse the book. He or she can select the number of books he would like to order. And then depending upon, let's say if he's 2, 3, or 4, I calculate the total cost. The boundaries over here specify the order, the hierarchy of the components. So this whole red thing is actually one component. Let's call it the book component. Within it has an image, some text, a drop down, blah, blah, blah. And these are two subcomponents of my book component. One component, which is unit price, you give it a number, let's say 200, 300, whatever, it will print the unit price. And then the total cost is you give it the quantity as well as the unit per price, and it will calculate the total price of the person. And of course, then there is checkout. The idea over here is that these two components should be memoized so that they don't have to re-render again and again. So to show you the problem, for example, let's say I clean it up, I refresh my page. So it's rendering my book component, it renders my unit price component, and it renders my total price component, right? One red one, black one, and blue one. Perfectly fine. If a user selects the quantity to be 5, let me remove it again and have a clean one. So let's do it this way. Now, in this case, it makes sense for the total cost component to be re-rendered because after all it has to multiply 7 by 200. But there is actually no need to change the unit to re-render, to re-execute the unit price component, right? Because at the end of the day, it hasn't done anything new. Between all the renders caused because of the drop down and the checkout, this thing is actually pretty solidly uh, constant, right? So we could save some performance over there. The other important thing is, let's say if I would like to check it out, I would like to check out my book, put it to the card or something. If I select on this one, I still get my book and the unit price component re-rendered. There is again no reason to do that because the cost hasn't changed. It's because my just because my parent, which is book state, has changed. I should not be re-rendering these two, but it will because that's how React works. It's called tree shaking. As soon as it figures out that the parent has state has changed or prop has changed, it will do the same thing for all the subchilds or subtree without it. So let's have a look at the code to understand. So that's my app.js. I have a book component. Thank you. What does my book component do? I have defined a unit price, some quantities, that is my drop down. That's the console.log. A state to track the checkout button as well as the quantity. Some image, some text, blah blah blah. Nothing major over here. On change of the select, I change my quantity state. If I go down, there's a checkbox. Click or unclick of it, I change my checkbox state variable, state property, state. Let's call it just state. These two things, and because these two changes things are changing upon user interaction, I have unit price and total price, which are also getting rendered every time. So let's see first of all what can I do with unit price so that it does not render. Because at the end of the day, it's a pure function. For those who are new to functional programming, pure function is actually any function which will take if I give the same parameters to a function and it every time returns the same output without causing any other change anywhere else in the world, uh, that is a pure function. So a function which multiplies two number is always a pure function because we know 37 into 13 will be 481 unless you are in some other planet and the mathematics works otherwise. Who knows? Maybe it does. Then it's not a pure function. But for the time being, it is a pure function. So what can I do? My whole aim over here is to tell React, hey React, as long as unit price doesn't change, please don't bother executing this. Just return back the value. And it's pretty easy for React. All you have to do is to say React.Memo. And then we can specify my price. That's it. That's all we have to do, right? And see the magic now. If I could do it like this, I refresh, my book component got rendered, my unit price component got rendered, and total price component got rendered. Perfect. If I change my selected quantity, I have my book component and the total price. Let's do it again. I change my 3 to 8. Only two components are getting rendered now, right? Though it is showing me the output. Make no mistake, it's not that unit price is not showing up. It is showing up, it's just that it's not executing my code. What React says, for the unit price of 200, I know the output is this HTML. So I don't even bother going into this function and executing it. I'll simply just print this thing and add it to my render tree. Pretty great, pretty great. Having seen one version, let's look at the other version, other flavor of it. My total price component takes two values, unit price and quantity. So I simply blindly multiply it and I just gauge out whatever the answer is. One use case over here is that of a checkout checkbox, right? Since it changes the state, it will also change total prices over here. Now, what I would like to do is to override the React.Memo functionality and then say, And I should be able to, as a developer, I should be able to tell React, okay, React now, React Memo version should not be used. Now you actually go ahead and forcefully um, execute my code, right? Because remember, in unit price, as we saw here, it is by default. React was doing its own magic to figure it out, but I want that magic to myself. So what I would like to say is somewhere in my total price component, I should be able to do some function. I should be able to write some kind of a function here which will return true or false. That would be a key to React to know whether the memoize function is version is correct or not, right? So what I can do, and React Memo, actually you might have already guessed, that's a overloaded function of React.Memo. So what I can do is something like this. So I can say, hey, React memoize my beautiful, beautiful function, total price. And voila, 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 I have another function which will give me previous props. I will also get my next props, basically whatever was previous render, this is the next render, and then I can return true or false based upon whatever I want to do. So in my case, what I can do now is to say, let's maximize this thing. Oh, I already have one. Copy paste it. Hey, React. Whenever you are in doubt about my memo, whether what to do about it, just check the unit price and the next unit price as well as previous unit quantity and the next quantity. If these two values match, then don't bother about running it. Just use the memo function. Otherwise, no, go ahead and you run my code, my function in its complete entirety. So that's how that's where I can force React to execute my function. So let's see if this actually works. Let me make this thing a bit close, refresh the page. All the three buttons, that's perfectly fine. Remove it. Let's change the quantity, 5, 1000. Perfect. Remove it. Now, if I click on checkout, it should not take into account the total cost. It should not execute the console log for that one. And if I do that, then that's pretty much what it is. Now what React is doing is, as I said, just use the old version of the code. Pretty good. So the question that came to my mind is if React.Memo actually saves us performance, then why not just do it by default? I should be writing all my components by default. React.Memo should be part of it, right? Why not do it? Um, there are two schools of thought. I did some bit of research, and it turns out one school of thought is that yes, you should do it. Do it for all the components by default. The other school of thought is saying don't do it. The arguments they're saying is mainly twofold. Is first is if it was so good, why wouldn't Facebook put it? I mean, I agree. I mean, I'm pretty sure Zuckerberg is a better programmer than I am. So if he's saying don't use React.Memo, if he hasn't put it in React by default, there has to be a reason. And turns out the reason is actually about the function which we wrote, the comparison function. The idea being if it is primitive, prop types are primitive, then go ahead, do it for all your components if you want. The sooner your object becomes complex, and because it's a shallow copy at the end of the day between the two for the React.Memo. Um, and if your objects are complex, if it takes more time to compare the objects itself rather than rendering the component, then the whole purpose of React Memo is lost, right? I personally tend to go with the second approach. My idea is so when I start writing my components, I don't think about React Memo. I write my components, and what I do is to look into the profiler of what are the components which are taking too many times. Remember, too much optimization is also sometimes not that good. So, what I would recommend is write your components as beautifully as you can. React is beautiful, thank God. And if you see some performance degradations, look at the profiler, see what components are taking too much time to render, and if we could use React.Memo over there. So I hope this answered your queries about React.Memo. If you have any other questions, please do put it in the comment section. I would love to take your queries on. And if you like this video, please hit like, share, and subscribe. It will motivate me a lot. Take care, and I see you soon.